All right, welcome back, everybody. We're so glad to have you here, and I am excited to introduce you to our next distinguished panel of doctors, led by Dr. Chris Cimino. We're going to be doing a day in the life, letting you know what it's like to actually be a doctor of various kinds.
My name is Sadhna Rajamoorthi. I trained in family medicine, have been practicing as a full-time primary care physician, but just recently actually converted to now doing full-time global health work.
And Seth, why don't you go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Seth Meltzer. I trained in internal medicine and I'm now currently a cardiology fellow down in Washington, D.C.
And Ned.
Thank you very much, Chris. As everybody here, my name is Ned Palmer. I trained in internal medicine in Cincinnati and I'm now on the global health faculty at Boston Children's Hospital. And
thank you, everyone. And thanks for being here. It's always fun to talk to medical students and pre-medical students. So I'm glad our audience is here as well. I think you'll find this an interesting panel. We're going to talk about what it's like to be a doctor. And to kick things off, I'm going to ask each of you to talk about what's the best part of your day as a doctor. And I'm not seeing patients anymore, but I would say that the best part of my day was feeling like I was helping someone or helping a family. Often with neurologic disease, it's a family affair because the person is having difficulty just getting through their life. And so really demystifying those challenges and helping the family figure out how to cope with something that can be very frightening, and reassuring them is a very gratifying feeling. And of course, teaching medical students was always part of that too, and that's a good thing as well. Ned, how about you?
yeah, thank you. I mean, I think my answer may be what lots of people will echo, but frankly, being at bedside, the best part of my day about being a physician is being at bedside, and whether that's here in Boston, overseas in global health, domestically working on Native American reservations, just serving communities and serving patients.
Sadhana.
For me, I would have to say, so the whole reason I went into family medicine is to be able to kind of see, from birth to end of life. And so that spectrum of good health and, bad health is the reason I chose it. And so I think that was my favorite part, being able to, especially going through training and then a little bit afterward, being able to deliver a baby, taking care of that mom, prenatally delivering that baby, taking care of that baby and the mother afterward, to the point then after, a few years of practice, being able to see, I think I got to see 3 generations, within the same family was really the most gratifying and humbling experience that I've really ever had.
And Seth?
I would certainly echo the comments about definitely being at the bedside, and I spent a lot of my time inpatient, so I'm still in training. I spent a lot of time in the hospital, and in addition, what I like is really, which I didn't understand that much early on, was really how much of a team sport medicine is. I'm constantly on a team in the hospital with other medical students and residents, and we have an attending physician, or if I'm doing a procedure and on a patient with heart disease and we need to discuss the results with a surgeon, I think the best part of my day is just working with another doctor, working with other residents, really communicating and knowing that at the end of the day, we're all doing what we can to take good care of the patient.
And how'd you choose your specialty, Seth?
In medical school, the classes that interest me the most were always physiology and pathophysiology. So how did the body work, and then how, when it didn't work, how things could go wrong. And so that kind of naturally led me into internal medicine. And so I did a residency for internal medicine for 3 years. And then at the end of that, I was deciding, do I want to sort of stay as a general internist, or do I want to go into one subspecialty? And so from that standpoint, there were a couple different organ systems I liked. I liked the kidneys, I liked the heart. I eventually decided to go into fellowship in cardiology, probably multiple reasons. One, I sort of thought the heart was the most interesting. It had the most interesting physiology. I wanted to do something that was really prevalent, that like a lot of people were going to have. And I mean, everyone knows, mother, father, uncle, aunt with heart disease, with heart failure, with heart valve problems. And then the last thing was that just cardiology is so varied. You can spend time inpatient, seeing people that are acutely ill in the hospital. You can spend time doing procedures. You can spend time reading ultrasounds and reading EKGs. You can spend time in the clinic. So it was a very varied field, and that was certainly I liked about it.
And Ned, you're Med Peds. Could you explain what that is and how you chose that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Med Peds is a combined residency in internal medicine and pediatrics. Each one is typically 3 years, but the combination drops that down to 4 total years of training. You end up board certified in both, if you choose to end up board certified in both internal medicine and pediatrics. I think we just had our 50th year anniversary of the specialty, so it's fairly well established now. Really affords a broad number of opportunities that stem from it. That really speaks to where I got into it in the first place. I wanted to stay as broad as possible, but keep my options open if down the road I wanted to pursue something like that, cardiology. And as I went through, I learned that instead of going deeper into the physiology and pathophysiology like stuff, I zoomed out even, and I turned and kind of redirected after training to go more into public health and global health. Zooming out of individual organ systems and looking at whole healthcare systems, health networks, and systems level patient integration. And so it's really afforded me fantastic opportunities to be engaged at different levels that I really found valuable to me in terms of the services I provided.
Yeah, that's similar for me. The one of the most frequent questions I get about my specialty in neurology is, how could you go into that? It's so depressing. Because people are thinking of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and things like that. They seem to forget that headaches and seizures are very treatable, and that's a very common piece of the practice as well. But I've pointed out to people that, and it goes back to my, the best part of my day kind of thing, those challenging diseases, you're not just helping the patient, you're helping the family, and that's just as important, just as gratifying. But how I chose my specialty, I've always been interested in learning theory and psychology and how the brain works. And so I was sort of a natural for, should I go into psychiatry or should I go into neurology? And I chose neurology because I thought psychiatry was too depressing. So that's how I ended up there. But I was always looking still for that way of combining both the technology aspects, artificial intelligence, and the biological aspects. I got to tell you, we're still not there yet. But I chose to do a subspecialty in clinical informatics, which is really about manipulating clinical information to improve medical care, help doctors do their job better. And from there, I got very involved in education, medical education, and computer-based education. So kind of a little bit all over the place. I will say that the audience, just feel free to put questions in the chat, and our staff will feed them to us, and we'll try to work them into the conversation. The next, we actually have a question from the audience already. Someone who's talking about how their dad, who's in internal medicine, is very stressed at time, and asking how to deal with that stress. And it kind of ties in also to what was going to be my next question, which was about how COVID has affected your practice. Certainly doctors across the country are under a huge amount of stress, nurses as well, the whole medical system is stressed. So Seth, why don't you go first with that one?
Certainly a big question. In terms of how COVID affected my training, I'm down here in Washington, D.C., and so we were in, kind of that April to June period was certainly decently busy with COVID. And there was a lot of talks, because I'm, as I said, trained in internal medicine and now in cardiology. There was a lot of talks in the hospital of, are we going to need to deploy extra people? Because now we just have this insurge of patients in the hospital who need someone to care for them. So there was a lot of preparations for that. One of the other things that I did was the city of Washington, D.C. opened up, they actually never needed to use it, thankfully, but they opened up the convention center as a sort of secondary hospital. And so I volunteered with another one of my co-fellows, and there were like hundreds of us there that sort of went through training of how could we set up this convention center into, a 500 or so bed hospital, and how could we get things set up? It was a lot of it was in preparation, and eventually, as I said, they actually never really needed it. But that was, I feel like, a way that's I was going to get to work with my colleagues and help take care of the pandemic.
And Sadhana?
Yeah, so being an outpatient primary care, it was quite an adjustment. And I still remember those first few weeks of really not knowing what the recommendations were, whether are we masking patients, are we not? How do we see geriatrics and, babies, peds, all in the same kind of coming through the waiting room. So it was very concerning and kind of chaotic for, again, in most health systems. But as things settled down, I think, especially in outpatient primary care, what we noticed was, understandably so, PPE was going to the hospitals. And so we really struggled with getting appropriate PPE in outpatient settings. So anytime a patient came in with a fever, it was always a bit of concern. And I remember, we were using like N95 masks for weeks at a time and things like that. Again, all things that probably everyone would echo. On a personal level, how it affected it. Well, there's always a lot to say about women in medicine and the multiple roles that we kind of juggle and have to play between our work and home. So, my decision to take a break from full-time clinical medicine. Now, I do still moonlight and volunteer at our local free and charitable clinics, but, a personal reason also for that was just the toll that, inconsistent daycare and things like that were taking on the family. And so, there's always a tremendous amount to be said about that, but that's also how it has personally affected my practice.
And Ned?
And I'll go back to the original question. I think what's notable is, I think the original question just asked about stress, like just stress as working as a physician. And I think my own initial answer was exactly in line with Seth's and Sadhna's here, of just like COVID, just capital C COVID is like the source and the cause of so much stress and so many challenges over the course of this year. I feel like you both spoken brilliantly to that. So I'll just speak more general to the sense of like the stress of being a physician, the long hours, late nights, even before COVID, challenges with trying to find time to juggle family responsibilities, community responsibilities, and things like that. Some early advice that was actually really helpful to me from a mentor was find something related to medicine that isn't necessarily your day job that brings you that joy, that helps keep you in touch or contact. It sounds like for Sadhna, there's some, well, actually, honestly, for both Seth and Sadhna, it sounds like there was like volunteering, participating, helping your community, all of those things, using some of the skills that like you develop as a physician, so much more of which is just biochemistry, pharmacology, and finding opportunities like that. And so that's really where a lot of my, in terms of how do I deal with the stress, is like that's an offshoot, using the myriad of skills that you develop. I know, Chris, you talked about the informatics and how that's an offshoot of medicine, but certainly isn't clinical medicine. Finding these pieces that are related to medicine that I have found have been invaluable before this year and now during this year are really kind of the bedrock upon which I've been able to carry on because of the challenges.
And I would dissect that a little further and say there's really three kinds of stress. One of them is just burnout. If you work long hours and you think you're a hero and you're going to do it all, and you do that day after day after day after day, and then you have to do double shifts and stuff like that, everybody is susceptible to burnout, and you need to be paying attention, not just for yourself, but your colleagues, when you start seeing the danger signs of that and figure out how to back off. The second is that work-life balance. You can get a lot of gratification from the stress of the hospital, but if you sacrifice time with your family, that's going to create a different kind of stress. And then that last stress is a positive thing, and particularly emergency medicine and surgeons are attracted to that, that crisis of the moment where you are able to step in and do something. And that feeds into one of the questions that was asked, at least for me, which was, how did you know you wanted to be a doctor? I grew up in a family of doctors. My uncle, my father were doctors, my mother and my aunt were nurses. My two older brothers went to medical school. And so it was like, of course you're going to go to medical school. But I didn't really know until my junior year of college. I was like planning on it and, you know, and all that. But I was taking a drive with my girlfriend at the time from Providence to Cape Cod, and the car in front of us suddenly swerved. There was not much traffic on the road, suddenly swerved, went off the road, rolled down a hill. I shouted, "Stop the car." I told her to wave down some traffic. Smoke's coming out of the car. And we corralled a bunch of people to, there was a woman who was trapped between the roof and the seat. We corralled a bunch of people to actually lift the car up and pull her out. Someone, you know, contacted the fire department. And I don't know why I, you know, I didn't know what to do, but I did what I thought was logical. And there was a real sense of gratification that if someone else hadn't done that, I don't know who would. So I did it. And I felt like I did something positive. And that changed my whole attitude. Up until that point, I was like, yeah, I guess I'm going to be a doctor. But then I was like, I want to be a doctor. So that was my epiphany. How about you guys? When did you know for sure you wanted to be a doctor? And Ned, why don't you go first this
time? Mine wasn't as dramatic. That's a tough one to follow.
Yeah, it is.
But, I actually had a career as a research chemist. I had gone to training for pure and applied sciences. I'd gone to school for pure and applied sciences. I was working as a research chemist in nanotechnology. It was a fantastic job, and I felt something was missing and I struggled to identify it. And so I just started looking for opportunities. I ended up taking a weekend job doing clinical research in an emergency room. So a lot of people take these transitional jobs, fairly low paying research coordinator jobs to try to get their feet in. And really right from the first couple of days, I was like, oh, this is applied science. Like, this is the type of scientific application that like lands with me. It was human focused, human centered, solution, like every day was problem solving, every day was just trying to do something better for what's in front of you. And it was much more tangible to me because I struggled with the disconnect between benchtop science and the actual tangible benefit. And so really right from those first experiences of being the research coordinator, was like, oh, okay, I was wrong. This feels better. And so diverted my life at 15 years ago and haven't looked back. And it's just, yeah, it has felt right ever since. So.
And Sadhana?
For me, I would say it started with taking trips to India as a child. We wouldn't go frequently at all, but all of our extended family are there. And sort of to what Ned had spoken about earlier in terms of health systems strengthening and just seeing pure just lack of access. And so that was one thing. And then probably during college, another trip there, I got to see the kind, running to the OR to deliver a baby and then taking care of that baby. So I got to see that whole gamut. And then I knew that going into medicine, I just felt that was, I think, as Ned just now said, that application is just so clear. But of course, there are many routes, but really it is the most direct application. And I think that, that was the reason I chose it.
For me, it's tough to describe. It's honestly the only thing I've ever thought about doing. I remember I was 13 or 14. I was always had like a math and science brain. I was always much better at those at school and was interested in how things work and kind of thought that way. And I just wanted to combine that sort of thinking with helping people. And I remember I looked up when I was younger, like what was the earliest age you could volunteer at the hospital, and it was 14. And so when I was 14, I went to the hospital and I would volunteer just either sorting paperwork or helping move patients around the ER. But I just remember I got like a badge at the hospital and I brought it home, and I was like so proud that I like had a badge, even though it just said student volunteer. But that just was so excited. I knew when I was going to go to college I wanted to go to a place that had pre-med and was going to get to a medical school after that. So I didn't have any doctors in the family, unlike Chris, so it wasn't something that other people were putting on. It was just something in me. That's what I just have always thought about doing.
There's several questions about what the first year of medical school and the first year of residency is like. And it's sort of an interesting choice because my recollection is the first year of medical school was the most intellectually challenging, and the first year of residency was the most physically and emotionally challenging. Anyone who has comments or stories to relate to that, let's hear them.
I'm happy to start. So
Sure.
I went to Ross University Caribbean Med School in Dominica. So my first year of medical school was involved uprooting my entire life and moving to a different country. It was the second time I'd done that, but the first one was Canada, so a little bit different. And so there was so much happening that I think because you kind of describe it very well, it's intellectually challenging in a way that those two words wildly underrepresented. Because it's not just learning materials. For me, it was learning how to learn. It was how to be a student, how to capture this material, not just for a test, but for life. And so it was a totally different, it completely shifted and inverted the way that I experienced education and as a student. And so that I think was really the heavy intellectual lift, was restructuring, frankly, a lot of maladaptive patterns I'd picked up in undergraduate where we weren't tested or tried in the same way. And that tangible connection to a patient was like, okay, yeah, maybe this is the structure of a histone and it seems a little disconnected, but you could still see that is a person's piece of biochemistry, and there's value in knowing that information, and how do you beat that into you for life? So it was very challenging. Whereas the first year of residency, I like was honest, it was such a marathon that I almost I kind of got through and don't remember it super well. Like it was like, I remember the challenges, I remember stories, I still have patients I communicate with. It was 7 or 8 years ago now for my first year of residency that I still keep in touch with, even though I'm no longer in that city. Like so much more of like that human connection that he finally got after years of working for it was so strong and so powerful. But very physical instead of intellectual, which is a great way to put it.
Seth or Sadhana, anything else to add to that?
I thought you said it very well, Chris, about first year med school being intellectually demanding. You know, everyone always says it's like drinking, you know, out of a fire hose, all the information you get. That is certainly true. And I can speak more to the first year, and then first year of residency, I would agree as well, physically demanding. And the biggest thing I remember about it was, again, just learning how to sort of be a part of a team and learning your role in the hospital. You pick up a little bit as a third and fourth year medical student where you kind of see how things work, but then as an intern, when you know you're the primary person caring for a patient and a nurse comes to you with something, and I remember one thing I realized very early on is it's not only that you don't know that much, but you never know anything, and just early on knowing who to ask for help, knowing this is something I can look up on my own, this is something I can ask my second year resident for, this is something I can ask my attending for, this is something I can ask the physical therapist for, this is something I can ask the radiology department for. That was the biggest skill I think I learned, was knowing your limitations, knowing that it's okay to say, I don't know. If someone asks you a question, hey, like which medicine should we give? It's okay to say, I haven't really seen this before. Let me, discuss with my second year resident. Let me, figure out what test is best to order. Let me figure out how to go talk to this patient and talk to this family. So it's all those skills in real time, and knowing that it's okay to not know the answer, and that there's so many people in the hospital that are looking out for that patient, looking out for you. Even though you are kind of that first call, first person, you are not alone at all.
Yeah, I definitely felt, definitely echoing what everyone has said. And I think I said it perfectly in terms of just first year, all that I ever really remember is being in the lecture hall and, just constantly just getting information thrown at you. One of our pulmonology attendings used to always say, in medical school, your brain is just like a blank wall, and whatever is being thrown at you is like mud being thrown at you. And so mud doesn't always stick to that wall, and it's going to kind of trickle down. You're going to forget it. And then they just keep throwing mud at you. And so he used to always start every one of his lectures with that analogy. He's just saying, I'm going to throw a bunch of mud at you. It's okay if it doesn't all stick right now. You have time, right? You have time. You can then go home and study and do, group study sessions. And so that was really nice. I felt that intern year, although in the same city, so, I went to med school and did training in DC, and it was a totally, just 180. I remember my, intern month in the ICU, and just very poorly resourced hospital. And so it was just a senior and me. And I remember just being there from early, morning hours and rounding and getting all that prepared. They called a code. And so the senior went up to the code, and that then left me in the ICU by myself. And one of the nurses came running out of the room saying, "Hey, the patient is coding." And I will never forget that point where exactly how Seth and Ned said, you turn to whoever you can for help. And as crazy as this sounds, it's my first weekend in the ICU. And so I turned around to the secretary, who she's the one that pages on the hospital system saying that there's a code. And I turned to her and I said, "Can you please call a code?" And she just looked at me and she laughed. And she's like, "Honey, we're in the ICU. We don't call the code from the ICU. You have to respond to this." I will just absolutely never forget that. And I just remember running into the room. We have 2 nurses in the ICU again, seniors gone. We didn't have the attending in the hospital yet. And it's remarkable, right? So 4 years difference, sitting in a lecture hall, 4 years later, I'm doing chest compressions on a patient. It's just mind blowing. And I actually remember even thinking about that, like during that time, just that adrenaline and you wanting to do the best that you can. And obviously you have a support system, but you would be just mind blown, like in terms of your progression and growth in just 4 years time.
And you survive those experiences, and that sort of gives you strength to face the next ones. I'm going to focus on the other end of the timeline, which is, students in college who apply to med school, they're often at the top of their class. They're used to getting 80s, 90s on their tests. And they arrive at med school and half the class is going to be below average. It's a real shock. And, that's just statistics. That's the way it is. But the other piece is the volume of content. Typical medical school, you are taking 3 courses, 20 hours a week of lecture or lab or interactive sessions, probably more than 20 hours of studying, probably closer to 40 hours of studying time for those classes. And then your final exam is 8 weeks later, and then you have another set of courses, and the pace in that first year is relentless. And for students who are used to getting 80s and 90s, they, a lot of them never really thought about how they got the 80s and 90s. They just sort of did what they were told. They absorbed the material, and then they go to the test. And now suddenly it's like, no, whatever you would do in college isn't working. You got to figure out a way to make it work. This does touch on a question that's come up, and a question I wanted to ask, which is, what's your least favorite part about your job or your specialty that you wish you didn't have to do? Everyone's happy. No, there's got to be something.
Paperwork.
Yeah, paperwork. I knew that was going to come up.
It's a low hanging fruit, but I finished a shift and spent 2 hours documenting. Mm-hmm. And it's not optional. You have to, that I think is where part of the frustration comes from, is it has some value, but not as much as the time that it demands. Mm-hmm. I don't know if Sadhna feels the same. That's my sense of it.
How about Seth and Sadhana? Anything besides paperwork?
Sort of along those same lines, though, there's some things, for instance, I rotate through 2 hospitals. There's a VA hospital and then another hospital in DC, and they're literally next to each other. I'm walking between them, but they're on completely different medical record systems. And so if a patient is at the VA hospital, then they happen to, for some reason, need care across the street, you would think, in the 21st century, it would just be easy to sort of log on the computer and see their record and see what images they've had. But a struggle, certainly on the training side, when you're taking care of a patient, they were at this previous hospital, and trying to track down those records, is things like that, along the paperwork way, but things you think we should be able to have done in the 21st century. And we talk about a lot, but it's sometimes it's a challenge.
And you can blame my colleagues in medical informatics that they haven't solved the problem yet. It is a difficult problem. If you think about it, the medical record system is set up to do a couple of things, one of which is keep all that patient information secure, which invariably makes the doctor's job harder. But they aren't designed by, people at Apple or Microsoft. They're designed by, a different crowd of people who usability isn't their main goal. It's actually things like billing and performance, financial performance that they're building into these systems, because the person buying it is the CEO, CFO of the hospital, not the doctors. And so there's a lot of complaints by doctors about how that makes their job harder. And it's sort of like the paperwork problem, only now it's like even worse, because you can't just write whatever you want. You have to like pick things from a menu, and then you got to find what, where's the right menu and stuff like that. People find it very frustrating and not rewarding, the way helping a family or solving a medical problem is. Ned, there was a question. They wanted you to expand on your work with the reservations, how you got involved with that, what that was like.
Absolutely, yeah. So global health has been kind of a thread that's woven through my entire training. Like I said, I went to school in the Caribbean, and so right off the bat, some of my first traditional medical school experiences were what I think people at domestic med schools would consider global health. I mean, we were in a local hospital in the capital, with inadequate resources, insufficient supplies of things, and those are my first examinations on patients, and some of my earliest experiences of healthcare. In Dominica, there's been some improvements now, some losses, unfortunately, following a couple of pretty horrible hurricanes down there. But global health as a threat has really been a part of my training the entire time. In residency, I was lucky enough to go to a program, and I searched and sought out a program that had a strong global health cadre there, and some of the leadership had been working very closely with the Navajo Nation for years. So down in the Four Corners region we were on the Arizona-New Mexico border, but working within the Navajo Nation there. And from what I learned there in residency about the Indian Health Service and how it operates as a structure of the federal government, and how it operates as a truly separate, asterisk, unique, independent manner in which healthcare is delivered in America was fascinating to me, in terms of just going back to this idea of health systems and how healthcare is delivered to individuals. And so from that, branching out through contacts, and then frankly, with the needs that I'm sure nobody on this panel, and frankly, the thousands of people watching this from home or have seen the reports of the mortality in Native American reservations around the country from COVID are orders of magnitude higher than other communities around this country. And so as that need rose really acutely during the COVID emergency response, just basically started calling people and seeing what opportunities there were to engage. And so have worked with the Alaska Native Health Service up in Northwest Alaska, worked in Western Montana on Native American reservations there, worked in Central California. There's, honestly, I should know the numbers and I don't, but I think there are thousands of reservations, each in some way independently overseen with a health service or a health cluster involved in their care. The way that care is delivered is variable, quite variable, and fascinating to me. And so in terms of how to get involved, you just start talking to people and start asking. There is more demand than supply. And so any hands at any stage in your interest, there is an opportunity to absolutely to pitch in, to learn the systems, to get involved.
Sadhana, I see you nodding your head yes. What's your experience? And tied to this is also the more general question of healthcare equality and inclusion, diversity, et cetera.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That's exactly, I mean, just going off of that, I think, if there is a strong interest or a passion. I remember in medical school, we actually, a group of us, we did a study where we surveyed a bunch of students at different med schools throughout the country to see what are the types of demographics of students that are then choosing to practice in, certain certain areas of the country, and found that a lot of times students who are coming, for example, from an urban setting tend to go back and practice in an urban setting. If you're coming from an underserved setting, then that's tend to be where you're going back and practicing. Regardless of what your background is, if you have a passion or develop a passion to, serve in these underserved settings, there are so many programs, exactly what Ned said. There are programs that make it really very clear that, hey, we only serve this specific patient population. And so, for example, a lot of residencies may actually say, for example, knowing Spanish is very strongly recommended, so things like that. I specifically wanted a program that has global health, is within the underserved community. And so that's how I chose the Georgetown Family Medicine program, because they specifically had that, and they make that very clear. So there are really countless number of opportunities, if that's your passion, to be able to follow that in medicine. And then later on, definitely in terms of practice, as Ned said, the demand is far greater than the supply. So just, tremendous amount of opportunity.
Seth, can you add to this?
As I was listening to Ned and Sadhana, it's just a small story that came up. Yeah, I know they've talked about sort of global health and sort of going and potentially working somewhere. There's even small things that, for instance, at our hospital in DC, we went to a local underserved high school last year for a day and just did a heart dissection with them. So just a small thing. It was one day, but I really enjoyed it. It was a couple of my colleagues, one of my attending physicians, procured some pig hearts and went, and the kids had a great time. And so there's even these more small things you can do. I think as someone was speaking earlier about just within medicine, there's just so much help you can do for the community in addition to just seeing a patient at the bedside. But there's going to a school and just getting some high school kids excited about science, excited about medicine, excited about how the body works.
Yeah, there's a lot of medical schools that have programs for high schools in underserved areas. Usually it's like a senior year science program, and partly it's just to provide the education, but partly it's to encourage people to go into medicine. Seth, I'm not sure if you're aware of the study that was done at a cardiology conference. I think it was about 15 years ago, and really touches on another aspect of this, which is implicit bias, the biases you are not aware you have. They had a patient case on paper, and they invited cardiologists to read the case and make their decision about what they would do. Would they do angioplasty? Would they send them home on medication, et cetera? But they randomized the participants. They were all cardiologists. They randomized them and included a picture. And the picture was either a white male, a white female, a black male, or a black female. And they also recorded how the cardiologist identified themselves as male, female, black, or white. And you're not going to be surprised to hear that the white male cardiologists were more aggressive with the white male patients than the black male patients. But it turns out it was true across all the cardiologists. So the black male cardiologists were also more aggressive with the white male patients. And so it was the same case. The only thing different was the pictures. And, raises all sorts of questions of like, well, how do we combat that? And one way is just to be aware of it. And I recommend people look at the Harvard Implicit Bias Survey. If you want to be shocked about what your own biases are, you can go there. You can choose whether it's religion or race or ethnicity, and it'll do this test where you have to decide quickly, left or right of the two stimuli, and it will reveal to you whether you have a bias along these different things. And most people have some kind of bias to something. So it's a challenge. It's also confused with socioeconomic differences. Is it the race? Is it the poverty in the community? Is it the attitudes of people within that population that contribute? It's a very complex issue. Questions about the kind of medical school you go to and whether that advantages you or disadvantages you in terms of residency match. And in particular for Caribbean schools, is their transition back to the US difficult? So Ned, it's a meaty one for you, so we'll go with you first.
I'm happy to speak to that. It is first I'll put a giant caveat on it that that's a shifting landscape. The relationship between Caribbean medical schools, especially residency positions, the numbers are shifting year over year in terms of there's new American medical schools being opened all the time, new domestic medical schools being opened all the time. There has not been really a substantial increase in residency seats to match. So the reality is that year over year, the number of so-called available seats to international medical graduates, which historically went to the Caribbean, is shrinking. The numbers are also not particularly favorable. I think a fourth-year graduate from an ND program in the US will match at their first choice, I think 94% of the time. In the Caribbean, I want to say this last year's match data was 61% will match on their first go-around. That doesn't include SOAP or Scramble, which is too far into the weeds for here, but it's it's just the numbers themselves tell a fairly substantial part of the story. There's so much to say on this. I think it really truly could be its own subject matter. It afforded me the opportunities that I needed to. I also know that at the time that I went, testing was different, standardized testing was different. I think as of this year, they're changing some of the historical numerical tests for the USMLEs to pass-fail, which some say levels the playing field, some say distorts the playing field, because if you can't compete numerically anymore, it's going to be a bit of a challenge to shift that level or to demonstrate that sometimes to program directors, which can be a challenge to get that residency position. So I apologize. I wish I had more clarity. I wish I had something more substantive to say other than that. I think the numbers tell a story that it's a challenge and it's getting more challenging. It's not necessarily a bad option. That is a very individual decision to make about whether you think you can do it, compare, compete. There's a lot of hardships that go into it. Living that far away from family, potentially for some of the first times, the stratospheric cost is still there, and the output is a gamble. And so it's just like all things in informed consent, knowing those are the most important features before you make a decision or embark down that path.
Seth or Sadhana, anything to add to this? I'll add, I spent a lot of time reading the data from both the match and USMLE scores. And there's a couple of interesting things that are not too deeply hidden, but they're there. The match rate for non-US citizen international graduates is lower, as kind of you would predict. You know, Caribbean is US citizens who go to the Caribbean are also considered IMGs, but their match rate is higher. But over the last 4 or 5 years, the match rate for international medical graduates in general has gone up quite a bit. It's mostly because fewer people are applying. Fewer people want to come to this country. I'll leave you to guess why that might have been over the last 4 or 5 years. The other thing, though, that's very concerning is the AMA does projections about how many physicians we need. And we basically are already in a physician shortage. And not just in rural areas, which has been the traditional thing. Of course, everyone wants to be in New York City or Los Angeles or whatever. But it turns out even in the urban cities, there's insufficient physicians, especially for the underserved communities. When you go to the Health and Human Services website, there's a place where you can see a map of underserved communities. And sure, they're in South Dakota, North Dakota, whatever, but they're also in major cities. And they're predicting that we will be short. I think it's like within 10 years, we will be short by about 30,000 physicians. That's a big number. That's basically only a year or two graduating class worth of physicians to be behind. So the bottleneck is residencies. Residencies are funded by government Medicare education funds, and there's a limit on them. And it hasn't been increased for about 20 years, 30 years, I think. And it's going to continue to be a problem until maybe it's until we get a crisis, and then someone will say, oh, we have a crisis, let's solve it. A lot of these things, both the disparities and the shortage, are really highlighted by COVID because it's like a stress test for the whole system, and some of these things are becoming clear. Question about death and dying, and how, as a physician, you can face that and sort of keep your head up. How do you persevere? There was another question which was also tied kind of the study load and the physical demand. How do you persevere through those kinds of things?
I can talk for part of it in terms of persevere with just the long hours and the studying. I think, as people have pointed out, Ned said, especially when you're in medical school, sort of, why are you studying this? You're not just studying it to pass a test, you're studying it to help the patient in the future, in 4 years when you graduate medical school. So always kind of having that drive in the back of my mind. That's why I'm kind of learning this anatomy. That's why I'm learning this pharmacology. It may not seem relatable in that first year medical school, but it will be down the road for sure. And then the other thing is, then once you are in training as a resident and you're in the hospital, those good patient interactions where you really help a patient, where they're thankful, you see their family, that's what really keeps you going. There's plenty of weekends, there's plenty of long hours, there's sometimes some challenging patient interactions, and you can feel down for a part of the day, and then you see someone in clinic, or you see a patient, and you make them feel better, you explain something to their family, and they're like so thankful that you did, and you took the time to explain them and made them feel better. And it's that kind of rush of feeling well that you help them, you help their family. That's what really kept me going.
Sadhana or Ned?
Yeah, I think, to the question about patients dying and being able to counsel family, those kinds of things, I think, honestly come with one, just having inspiring attendings. I would watch what you are going to have those mentors that are just remarkable. I mean, I think every single person in really any field would probably say they just have those, like, even if just few mentors that you'll remember forever. And so I still remember during residency, my ICU attendings, just remarkable humans. I don't think I've ever met just like such good-hearted people. And so every time they would speak to a family, the way that they had everybody sit down, the way that they made everybody, feel comfortable in the room, just when they walk, it is just those people that when they walk in the room, everybody feels like a sense of calm. And I think when you see that, you want to be that. And so then you start learning. So inevitably, you are always going to meet somebody that will guide you through those difficult situations. And I think, sort of even to what Seth said, the day-to-day going through the difficulties. I personally hate the word balance. I think it's impossible. So just understand that when you're at work, you're not with your child or your children. That's like, period. So, and when you're with your child or your children, you're not with your patient. And so there's just like no way to balance that. I think at the end of the day, you just have to ask yourself in both places, not whether you did your best, just like, do you feel at the end of the day, that your heart feels full, right? You had quality time at home, you had quality time, with your patients, and then quality time also for yourself. And you will find ways, whether that be exercise, whether, just other ways of how to kind of relieve that stress each and every day. And you'll kind of learn those patterns over time.
Yeah, I think the one thing that's really helped me is Seth, as you identified, is you really have to get to a place where you can hold on to the positive experiences and find a way to shed the negatives. Both are going to happen, either from a fire hose or like somebody's flinging mud at you, depending on which your favorite analogy is. But both are going to happen, and it's holding on to those moments and really being able to let go of the negative ones, having the support structures, having the people around you that you can lean on when you need help, shedding some of those shedding some of those negative experiences, and making sure that they're the same people who can celebrate the positives. The team-based approach to managing your life is vital there as well.
Yeah, but patients dying in neurology is certainly more common. Even though there's a lot of headaches and seizures, there's patients with Alzheimer's, et cetera. So dealing with that aspect of it, you never get used to it. And frankly, if I ever got used to it, I would know it was time to quit. But you create a boundary, and you sort of maintain that boundary of being able to say, I'm at home now, and that boundary is not going to affect me, or I'm not going to let it affect me as much as I can. And now I'm in the hospital, and I'm going to devote myself fully to it. Part of the question also talked about rude patients. You can be trained to deal with some of these situations. I was trained and then taught a class of students on how to deal with an angry patient. And that afternoon, I went to the clinic, and we had an angry patient. And I thought, oh, well, let me see if what they taught us works. Briefly, the resident saw the patient, came in, presented to me, and at the end, the resident was clearly rattled. He said, the patient called me stupid. And I said, really? Well, let's go see the patient together. And I had told the resident she was having muscle spasms in her legs. I said, tell her to drink quinine water. And the patient says, that's stupid. You're stupid. So we go in there, and I hear her story. And she tells me, this resident's stupid. He told me to drink quinine water. And I said, well, actually, I told him to tell you that. And she said, well, you're stupid too. And so then I'd like, okay, so when this happens, here's what you're supposed to say. It's like, I get the feeling there's something else bothering you. And she broke down into tears, and she told this really sad story about her mother has Alzheimer's. She in Staten Island, she comes to the Bronx for her medical care, and she's always afraid that her mother's going to wander away because it happened once before, and she's completely anxious. And like, she talked for like 15 minutes. At the end, she agreed to try the quinine water. And the next time she came back, she agreed that it worked. And we found her a clinic in Staten Island that she could go to. So, there's things where patients have a behavior that's part of their disease, in a sense. It's part of your job to figure out why they have it and how to deal with it. We only have time, I think, for one more round of comments. And I want to ask you guys what advice you would give to students who are thinking about applying to medical school. And Sadhana, why don't you go first?
I would say that if you have any interest, the opportunities are just so vast. There's just so much you can do. And I think having that degree is, you can do so much with it, is I guess what I'm trying to say. So if there's any part of you, whether that be direct patient care, medical school academics, clinical research, global health, public health, all of these things, just remember that, the core of it is medicine. And so if you really feel, hey, yes, you know what, I have the slightest idea of what I maybe want to do, and that may change over time. So having that degree and, your experience in that will really help you later on.
Seth?
I think a couple things came to mind. One, as Sadhana was saying, that things are so vast in medicine, so many different things you can do. And, we just talked about how is it challenging to deal with a dying patient for people who don't want to have those critically ill patients in the ICU. There's parts of medicine that are, 100% outpatient. There's parts of medicine that are 100% sort of just reading images and having a little bit less patient interaction. So, as Sadhana said, if you have that bug of just interested in the body and medicine and wanting to help people, and you're worried about the stress of the ICU, the stress of the dying patient, there are plenty of parts of medicine that don't have that. Or if you get excited about that, sick patient at 3 a.m. in the middle of the night, then there's parts of medicine that do have that. The other small advice I had that, and I think Ned said it very quickly, but I was lucky to have a teacher in high school who told me that you sort of go to college to learn how to learn. And then if you go to further graduate school afterwards, that's where you kind of learn your actual sort of trade or knowledge. And I think, as Ned had said before, if you guys are in undergraduate now, you don't need to necessarily learn every molecule or every part of chemistry. The point of what you're learning is how to be able to take in information and how to learn later. And the last thing I'll say is the learning doesn't stop in medical school, residency, fellowship, it never stops. There's, we were talking about conferences. There's, when you're constantly in the hospital, people are talking about this journal article or that, what was talked about at that conference. You always just have to have that desire to constantly learn. Know that you're not going to know everything, and you're always going to have that passion to learn.
And Ned?
I would say just talk. I am and have been historically, like, naturally a fairly shy, introverted, and walled off person. And at every stage, before medicine, now during a decade plus in medicine, at every time I took the moment, found that inner, that inner strength to raise your hand, to make your voice heard, to share something that you experienced in a way that you might never, that you would have internalized, taking that moment to share that opportunity, to share that question, to just expose yourself in some small way to the people that are around you that share similar interests. Those have been the positive moments that I've held on to that have powered me through the rest of this. They have led to some of the most fantastic experiences in my life of just taking that extra breath, that extra time, that wherewithal to raise your hand and ask a question, ask for an opportunity, ask to be engaged. I think from the outside, it looks like you're walled out, but there are so many opportunities for engagement just by raising your hand and saying, like, hey, can I help out? I've gained more from that than any other. That's probably the second most thing that I've gained from. The other is sharing experiences with people around me. It's led to, frankly, the emotional relief that I badly realized after several, like, fairly horrifying cases that I didn't have the introspective capacity to recognize that I needed. It led to career opportunities. It led to starting a whole business with a partner of mine who was a co-resident, because we just shared things that we otherwise would have walled off, and just realized that there's this whole world outside of yourself of people experiencing the same things, and collectively you're so much stronger.
Yeah, and the last thing I'd say is a medical career is not any one thing. There's students who arrive at medical school being sure they're going to go be a surgeon, and by the time they finish, they decided to do something else. I've seen surgeons who, have 10, 15 years career and decide they want to become psychiatrists. They go back and do a residency. People get involved in business, they get involved in art, they get involved in all sorts of things. And you can create a career that is yours uniquely. And so there's a lot of flexibility in medicine. So that's our time. I want to thank our audience for being here. And Jed, I turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. And students, please thank our distinguished panel here. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy days, making time to give back in this additional way, and give guidance to the next generation. That's really wonderful, and really appreciated the candid discussion about the difficulties and everything else. Thank you so much for that.